Hey, Tots. We're getting ready to be joined by, what's the name of your lab?
We are, what's the name of our lab?
The Upvoted Diamonds?
Yes.
Awesome. Hey, good Tots. We are excited to have the Outspoken Diamonds joining us today for a discussion about the green military off and biotechnology pieces. I think that this is going to be a spectacular discussion for you to be involved in. Make sure you're coming up with a couple of really good questions because you wrote this format, yes?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. And so if you're wanting to find out information about this green military format, this is the person to ask because he literally has the cards on it. And so
yeah,
this is a great time. You should dive deeply into this discussion if this is the format that you're looking at. Okay? Yeah.
So most of you know who I am because you're in my lab. For those of you who don't, my name is McAlister. You can call me Coach Mac. I work with WUDL. I've worked with Dennis a lot in the last year, writing topic papers and judging at tournaments. Yeah. So, can I get the names of people I don't know? What's your name?
Mosi.
I'm sorry.
Mosi.
Mosi. Nice to meet you. And the two young ladies at the table.
I'm Aiden.
Ada and
Aiden.
Aiden.
Yeah.
Okay. And
Evelyn.
Evelyn. Okay. Wait, Evelyn, did you debate for Stuart Hobson last year?
Yeah.
And you debated with Tyne?
Yeah.
I judged you at least once.
I think maybe during the middle school.
Yeah, that sounds about right. It was later in the year because you were running the water infrastructure app, the racing app. Yeah, yeah, I wrote that app too, and then I voted against it.
Yeah, it was kind of sad.
Yeah. Okay, and then I know my students. So we've heard a lot of talks this week about mostly cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, but there's a third part of the resolution. There's a third technology area, which is biotechnology, which we haven't talked about as much. And so, can someone tell me what biotechnology is? Noah?
Biotechnology is basically the use of, or the creation of technologies that create environmental organisms.
That's a good start. Somebody else want to add something? Okay.
Biotechnology, basically what Noah said.
Can you speak up, please?
Basically what Noah said
Mm-hmm.
about technologies that are made from not man-made objects, like ethanol.
That part I like too. So, like when we think about technology, and like cybersecurity and AI are, I think, pretty good examples of it, where they're based on electronics and they're mostly digital. And biotechnology is based, it's almost always carbon-based, which is based on biological processes. It's based on plants. It's based on DNA. It's based on, different things that we find in plants and animals and in humans.
Okay.
And so like a lot of, like anything you hear, any like medical technology or like agricultural technology talks about DNA, that's almost going to always be some form of biotechnology. And so in terms of this year's resolution, biotechnology is the technology that's been around the longest. Like you can make the case that biotechnology has been around for like 5,000 or 6,000 years, ever since we started doing things like interbreeding animals, interbreeding plants to get different results. And there are kind of three key areas that biotechnology focuses on and that we use it for. And the first one is for like health and medicine, where biotechnology is used to develop new treatments for diseases, new drugs. It's used to detect specific drugs. And like a key example would be how we responded to the COVID pandemic with new vaccines that use biotechnology to produce them. A lot of the drug tests use biotechnology research to detect COVID in the mucus from our noses. So a lot of these things that we think about in terms of how we treat diseases are based on biotechnology. The second way is as fuel. And biotechnology is really good at taking things like plants, at plant waste, at corn, when we talk about ethanol, hopefully in the future, things like algae, and developing processes for turning those into fuel that we can use to, fuel cars, fuel vehicles, and also to fuel power plants. With the idea being that in the long term, we can replace fossil fuels with biofuels. And that's what the affirmative is about. And that's what I'll be talking about in a little bit. And then kind of the third way that we use biotechnology a lot is to feed the world. It's for agriculture. And this is things like making different crops like wheat and corn and rice more resistant to pests, more resistant to diseases, better able to deal with extreme climates where they can thrive, and grow in hotter and colder climates than regular crops. Yes.
The agriculture section of biotech, is that mostly GMO?
Yes, that's part of it. GMOs are an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about, where we use biotechnology, we use science to change aspects of a crop so that in some cases it's for nutritional value, in some cases it's more resistant to like insects and pests, so it's more resistant to fungus, so it grows quickly. It's all that stuff. Yeah. And then there are a few kind of highlights of big biotechnology projects that have happened in the last 20, 25 years. Like the one I mentioned before was things like COVID vaccines. Does anyone else have an example that you can give me of what you think of as a high profile biotechnology project? Rakib?
Ethanol.
Ethanol is a good one. What's ethanol?
Corn fuel.
Yeah.
Fuel made from corn.
Yeah, and so the way we use it, so ethanol right now is the biofuel we use. It's the most common, and like Rakib said, it's a fuel that's derived from corn, where the corn is processed and then turned into a fuel that we can use in gas. And so most gas that you buy at a gas station is about 85% gasoline and 15% ethanol, and that's the substitute that goes into it. And we'll talk about ethanol a little bit more when we talk specifically about biofuels. Mostly, do you have an idea?
Yeah, you talked about how biotech can treat diseases.
Yeah.
So the malaria project, does biotech do that?
Yeah, pretty much any big disease research project, biotechs can be a part of it. So I think I guess the project that kind of brought biotech to the public imagination about 25 years ago was called the Human Genome Project. Have any of you heard of that? So the Human Genome Project was the first effort to sequence human DNA. It was to take human DNA and break it down into all of its individual components. And that work formed a lot of the basis for genetic medicine, for being able to model human DNA. If you think about something, does anyone here know what 23andMe is? What is it?
It's like a DNA testing for, I think, British.
Yeah, it's what mostly?
So 23andMe, they have the ancestry DNA test.
Mm-hmm.
That's basically more like a better way of doing it. But it specifically focuses on your genetic makeup or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what 23andMe is, it's a service that when you sign up for it, it's an online service. They send you a kit and they ask you to take a swab of your cheek and mail it back to them. And then it's a biotechnological process. They then analyze your DNA, and this is why it's derived from the Human Genome Project, because that was how we learned how to analyze human DNA. And so 23andMe will look at your DNA, and they can then send you back information about who your relatives are, about your ancestors, where they come from, what part of the world they come from. And there are millions of people who've signed up for the service. In a lot of cases, people have discovered that they thought they were from, Germany, and it turns out they're actually from England. Or they thought they were from, some part of South America, and they're actually from Spain or somewhere else. So it provides a very technical look at where people came from, what part of the world they came from, and you can also find relatives you didn't know about, or long lost family members. With you. Yeah. Have any of you tried Beyond Meat? I'll come back to you 1 second, Victoria. Or what was your question about 23andMe?
What was that process called?
I'm sorry?
The process, what was that
for 23andMe?
The one you said where they break down the DNA and.
You mean the Human Genome Project?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you spell that?
So it's 3 words. First word is human. The second word is genome, Genome. And the third word is project. So has anyone tried Beyond Meat? What's Beyond Meat?
It's basically meat it's meat that is made by plants. It's plant-based.
Mm-hmm. And where is it grown?
I know.
Anybody else?
I think it's grown in the US. Is it grown in the US?
Is it grown on a farm or is it grown somewhere else?
It's like in a factory.
Yeah, it's in a lab. So Beyond Meat is, it's a, like you're right, it's a plant-based material. Did you have something else to add?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So would it pertain to like them using biotechnology to use those plants to like make shape it into the meat?
Yeah, so I'll come to that in 1 second. So like Beyond Meat, and there's some of the other like that are plant-based meat substitutes, and there's other names for them, like the Impossible Burgers is kind of the same thing. What they've done is they've used biotechnology to take plant-based materials. So if you're vegetarian, you can still eat them. And then they're able to change the texture and change the taste and change kind of the way it all holds together in order to create something that tastes like meat, that looks like meat, but is actually plant-based. It's actually a vegetable. And that's a biotechnological process. So it's grown in the lab. And then probably the biggest one, or the one that will have the most impact on us, like in the near term, who knows what CRISPR is? So CRISPR is it's a scientific process that allows us to edit and change human genes. And it was the two women who like kind of completed the project and who created CRISPR to the form we know it now. They won a Nobel Prize for their work a few years ago. And like the future of medicine largely looks at what CRISPR can do. Is it has the potential to change someone's DNA to do things like make them less susceptible to disease, to ensure that they grow, healthy and strong, and to address kind of some chronic diseases by changing a person's DNA. It can also be used to affect like animal DNA and other kinds of DNA, and it lets us kind of manipulate what life looks like in a way that's never been possible. And like that's also biotechnological research, mostly.
Didn't something like Henrietta Lacks have something to do with the project that was based on like, it wasn't like the best way that they used their DNA or something that they used to treat cancer?
Yeah, so Henrietta Lacks is a Black woman whose blood, if I remember this correctly, her blood was used for like decades. It's kind of the basis for a lot of scientific research. And it wasn't, I think, until recently that anyone knew that she was the person who had been like the original person whose blood had been taken and then like synthesized and used over and over again in a lot of scientific research, and used in some cases in research projects that tried to cure cancer.
She never like said that they could use it. It was used
That's my understanding, is that it was like she never knew that what her blood had been taken for, and she never knew that scientists around the world had been using things derived from her blood in research projects. Her family never knew. It came out decades after it first happened. And I know that there have been some magazine articles, maybe a book about it, probably some TV shows about it. I wish I knew more detail, but that's, I think, the general idea. And then one of the things that I also want to talk about is the idea of who does research and where does research come from? Because this is a research space, this is a topic where it's emerging technologies. So one of the things that we should be talking about is where do technologies come from? And there are a couple of things I want to mention. But I guess the first question I want to ask is, who here has a cell phone? Where does your cell phone come from? I'm sorry?
Samsung.
Amazon?
Samsung.
Samsung, okay. So Samsung is, where is Samsung based?
South Korea.
Do you think all of the different parts of your cell phone come from South Korea?
No.
So let's talk about a cell phone. What are the key parts of a cell phone? What are the technologies in a cell phone that make it work? Key. Can you speak up?
The chip, the memory card, and the Wi-Fi router.
Yeah, those are three key parts. Can anyone add to that?
Is the SIM card the chip?
Is the SIM card the chip?
No.
No, they're different. The SIM card tends to hold information that lets your phone work on Wi-Fi and on telephone systems. The chip is the computer chip that makes the whole phone run.
Well, then
The SIM card, yeah. Anything else? What about the interface? What about the screen? What about the battery?
the camera.
The cameras, that's a good point. What about the software? That's the operating system. All
How it was coded.
and how it was coded. So when we think about a piece of technology like a cell phone, there's always, anywhere from, 1 to a couple hundred different kinds of technologies to go into it to make it happen. Pretty much all those technologies come from different parts around the world. They were developed at different times. And so when we talk about research, when we talk about biotechnology, it's kind of the same thing. It depends on there being this network of researchers who are all working on different parts of the problem and who are then able to, over a period of time, they build on each other's work to come up with solutions. Like the cell phone wasn't invented by someone who sat down and said, I'm going to make a cell phone and developed all of these technologies. Like it wasn't one person who said, I'm going to build a battery, I'm going to write the software, I'm going to design a computer chip, I'm going to design the glass, the interface. Like these are all different technologies that came from different parts of the world, the US, Europe, Japan, South Korea. And then the first real smartphone was the Apple iPhone. And they were kind of the first to integrate a lot of the ideas that we now take for granted in a cell phone. But they were drawing on technologies developed in different parts of the country, different parts of the world, and at different times. And so the example I want to use for biotech is CRISPR, which is the gene editing technology that we use. So the two women who kind of finished the project and who are best known for CRISPR, one's a researcher in Berkeley, California. One is a researcher in Germany. And they developed CRISPR around 2013. But the scientific breakthroughs and the processes that they used kind of came from three key spots. One was a researcher in Japan in, I think, the mid-90s. One was a researcher at the university in Spain about 5 years after that. And the third was a researcher at a yogurt company in Denmark. Because yogurt it's a combination of dairy products and like bacterial cultures. And you combine them and see what results. And so when they're trying to change for texture, for flavor, for how quickly it grows, for like how to make more of it, moisture, things like that, there's a lot of scientific research that goes into making yogurt. And CRISPR is a way of manipulating like these different elements of genes to see what the results are. And so the yogurt company was trying to manipulate different parts of the genes to see how to make different kinds of yogurt. And so you have these collection of like scientific breakthroughs that when you put them all together, you end up with CRISPR, which is a Nobel Prize winning technology that's going to kind of completely change medicine. But it's important to think about like science being this ongoing process that in some cases can take 15 or 20 years to develop. Like it's not like you just like pay $1 for research and get $1 back with the science. It's not quite that simple. And the other thing I wanted to talk about is not just that science is this collaborative ongoing effort, that research is this effort. I also want to talk about the role of the government and the role of private companies. So in the US, who do you think pays for most scientific research? Government?
The president.
So part of the government,
The people who are doing the research.
the people who are doing the research.
One is the government, but they also do private companies.
And so in the US, if you go back about 50 years, the government paid for about 2/3 of scientific research in the country. And for the private companies paid for about 1/3. Over the last 50 years or so, that graph looks like this. And now private companies pay for and do about 2/3 of the research in the US, and the government does about 1/3. And the important thing to remember too is that that's where the money comes from. When private companies do scientific research, they tend to do it themselves. when the government does research, it's usually paying other people to do it, mostly universities. Like the government spends a couple $100 billion a year on scientific research, but most of that is paying companies and paying universities and paying research organizations to do the research.
So my question is, like, you said the government pays like a couple $100 billion a year, right?
Mhm.
So that basically just increases their debt because they're already 30 trillion in debt.
I mean, as far as the federal budget go, what we spend on R&D is a tiny fraction of it. Like it's not even close to what we spend on the Department of Defense. Historically, the US has spent a much higher percentage of its GDP on research than we do now. So, I mean, it is a considerable amount, but relative to how much we used to spend and relative to the size of the government budget, it's not very much at all.
Also, for like investing in researchers and universities that are in the United States,
Mhm.
kind of still stays in the US economy, so it's
Yeah.
circulating through the feedback and tax.
Yeah, and that's another part of it is that the money we spend on research tends to be economically very productive. It's good paying jobs. It's a lot of scientific research then goes on to creating new companies around new products because they take the research and say, hey, we can do something cool with this. And that's how you, so let's take like Google as an example. Google was founded by a couple of Stanford University researchers who had a good idea. They got venture capital funding and 20 years later, they have $1 trillion company. Like that's kind of how, that's the process of how like government funded research becomes, economically valuable. It's through companies like this. And so in the US, and the reason this is important is because when I talk about biofuels, is because the Biofuels app is very much a research-based affirmative, more so than the other affirmatives we put together. But in the US, it's important just to keep in mind that science takes a long time. The government and the private sector both put a lot of money into it. And it needs to be this kind of like ongoing cooperative activity. Like those are probably the key things that I want you to take away from this. And then, oh, and the other thing I wanted to add too is with things like AI and cybersecurity, there are sectors that are moving really quickly. Like with cybersecurity, you have like new risks that come up on a weekly or monthly basis. With AI, the research is developing so quickly that we're seeing new applications for AI on a regular basis. Biotechnology moves slower. It takes a longer term investment, and especially for things like food and medicine, there's an FDA approval process, which means that a lot of the biotech research takes longer for us to pay for the research, have it be done, and then have it become something that comes to market.
So by you saying that biotechnology takes a long time, do you think that once that AI war against China, once the United States wins, the US wins, do you think that by using the AI to fuel, like not fuel, but help out biotechnology, do you think that could speed up the process?
If you listen to the people who are big proponents of AI, the answer is yes. And so part of it is that AI is really good at doing things like analyzing data. And part of the process, and part of like the research process for biotech is you have to do lots of experiments and see different results. AI is really good at looking at those results and figuring out a lot faster than most humans can what you should do next. And so kind of the idea with AI is that will make anything that has a big data collection and a big data analysis component be a lot faster.
You said that like in terms of biotechnology, I think like the research kind of like multiple locations like globally.
Mhm.
So in terms of the like US being in a technological like race with China
Mhm.
in terms of like who has the best stuff and those foreign stuff, like would either side be able to advance like if things are like the advancements are coming from like everywhere?
So the question is if like AI research is everywhere around the world, how can one side advance past the other one? Something like that. So there are a couple ways to think about it. One is that China has a very directed national strategy around developing AI, and a lot of China keeps its what we call an innovation ecosystem a little more segmented off from the rest of the world. So China is very focused on developing AI for Chinese uses. So they're trying to outcompete the rest of the world. Like in the US and Europe, we don't have the same kind of focus on AI as a national mission, but what we do have is this huge network of researchers, both at universities and at private companies, that are all working on similar issues. And kind of the role that the government and the military see for themselves is wanting to be able to direct some of that research towards areas that we think are valuable and that we need to use to compete with China. So I think there is I think the idea of there being a race between the US and China is one that is a useful way of thinking about it, and it's one that China has definitely invested in. So, and it's also kind of, it's not just that it's China versus the US, it's more so China versus the West that are competing for influence.
Do you believe that since the new military to military security policy, do you think that can help with the biotechnology? Because say the US is, since they're cooperating with Taiwan, say they're doing that, do you think Taiwan, if they ever had advancement in biotechnology, would share some of that with the US?
So one of the reasons that China has an interest in bringing Taiwan back into being part of China, more than they talk about a military invasion, is not so much that Taiwan is really strong in biotech, it's that Taiwan is really strong in computer manufacturing, in electronics and hardware. So like when you talk about like Chinese and Taiwanese relationships, it's more around advanced electronics and not as much around biotech.
So China is basically scared of Taiwan.
They think that they want to bring Taiwan's capabilities back into China. Like China sees Taiwan as being a province of China that is just kind of broken away for the time being, but it never will come back to be part of mainland China. And the question for them is just how quickly will that happen? The Taiwanese see it very differently. And then the last, I will move on to biofuels in just a minute, but the last thing I want to talk about, especially with this being a research topic and the Biofuels Act being a research and science-based affirmative, there are 3 programs that NATO runs that focus on research and development. The first is called Science for Peace and Security, which is a program they've had for a long time. And what that program does is it provides small amounts of research funding to researchers, universities, private companies in NATO countries and in other countries. And so like in 2016, 2017, there was a NATO-funded project to develop biofuels. It was a small project. The result was that they built a factory in Serbia to produce biofuels in small quantities. So we have a history of doing the Biofuels Act through NATO in ways that were pretty successful. It's kind of a question of scale, and there's some other reasons why it didn't develop more that I'll talk about. But 2 things that NATO has set up recently, and this is kind of the ways in which the affirmative would operate. They set up an organization called DIANA, which stands for Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic. And the goal of DIANA is for NATO put in, I think, about $1 billion. And that program is going to fund research within private companies and also within universities in order for NATO to generate and develop the best technology that it can use and the new technologies that it needs. And so that's more of a kind of foundational and basic science where they're looking at more questions about like, how does the thing work? You know, we had this idea about, you know, this technology might be useful for the military. How do we develop it more? And then the second thing that they set up is called the Innovation Fund, which is also funded around $1 billion. And that's a fund that looks more at companies that are taking scientific ideas and turning them into products. And this is a case where NATO will invest directly in a company that, say, for example, a company that comes up with a new way to produce a biofuel, NATO might use the Innovation Fund to invest in that company and give them the money to build up the infrastructure to be able to produce biofuels. Like it's also the case that it could be someone who develops like some kind of new armor for soldiers or new armor for vehicles that is cutting edge and worth, and NATO wants to buy it. They might fund a company to develop that process. So like NATO for the first time is investing pretty heavily in becoming a funder for scientific research on its own. And most of the programs are both set up in the last about 18 months. Victoria? Yeah. Mousy?
You said NATO did this project about scientific research, and then they ended up putting a factory in Serbia. Yeah. And so, what year was that done?
The research project was done in 2016, 2017. The news I saw about them setting up what they called a biorefinery was, I think, in 2020. And one of the things that the Biofuels Act talks about, and this is one of the reasons why that project wasn't more successful, oil prices have historically been low for the last few years. And for biofuels to compete with fossil fuels, a lot of it is a price war, and biofuels have been more expensive, so there hasn't been as much reason for people to invest in them. Here, and then I'll come back to you, Dennis.
In terms of the like groups or things that NATO has invested in,
Mhm.
how much like control over what those or like groups do with the money and like where the like results of the test go does NATO have?
Sorry, did you mention clean coal or did I mishear you?
What?
Did you mention the phrase clean coal or did I mishear you?
I
Oh, so you're just asking about how much money has NATO spent on these and where have the project's gone?
No, I'm asking how much control
Oh, how much control? Okay.
does NATO have over what people can like do with it and then the results that they.
So the way that most like scientific research works is an organization will put out like a list of ideas that they want researchers to look at. And sometimes it'll be, we'd like you to explore this area of this science. And then the people, and then the scientists themselves will put together a proposal that says, we think this is the way to go about it. And they usually get a bunch of proposals for any one topic, and then the funding agency will decide which scientists to give it to, and they'll have like a pretty well laid out research project. The other way that they go about it is sometimes the funding agency will say, we need this specific technology. Like we need, like, let's take, the James Webb satellite, the new NASA satellite that sent back the amazing pictures. Like for that, they will set out and say, we need a widget that can, control the temperature and control the power flow through these 3 devices. And we need it built to these tolerances. So it'll be a very specific thing where they say, we need someone to figure out how to build this thing. And they'll ask for something very specific. Because those are kinds of the 2 ends of what like a research agency will be asking for. And so in terms of control, it's mostly around approving the work plan that the scientists set out. But they get to choose who they fund. That's where the most control comes from. So after talking about scientific research and talking about what NATO is doing as far as R&D, we can talk about biofuels. And the first question I have for you, Rakib mentioned earlier, I think, that ethanol is a form of biofuel. Does anybody have other examples? Rakib?
Would solar energy technically count?
No, solar energy is electric energy. Like solar energy, solar panels convert sunlight directly into electricity. So ethanol is the most common biofuel used right now, and it comes from corn. The other sources for biofuels are things like switchgrass, which is another kind of plant. Medicine? I don't think there's much of a relation there. And then it's also things like plant waste, sometimes trees, and things like wood can be used for producing biofuel. It's pretty much any kind of like plant or tree or biological substance that can be converted into electricity, it can be converted into energy, can be used for biofuels. For next generation biofuels, which is kind of what the Affirmative focuses on, one of the big prospects is algae, which can be grown in huge quantities and then converted directly into liquid fuels that we can use in our cars. But the key feature of biofuels, I'll come back to in 1 second, is we're looking to develop liquid fuels that can be used in the same engines that vehicles use now to go into cars, to go into ships, to go into planes. Noah?
I was gonna ask you to use like plastics and paper, but that's not.
I'm sorry?
I was gonna ask you to use plastics and paper, but
No, you're looking more at raw materials.
How about like hydroelectric?
Hydroelectric is a different form of creating energy. Like you mean by hydroelectric, you mean like dams?
No, hydroelectric.
Or are you talking about hydrogen?
Like powering cities like Las Vegas with water.
Oh, so like building dams on rivers and stuff and using the turbine and using the electricity generated from those?
Yeah.
That's a different kind of power source.
So you said that one user that you could use would be increased. Do you think that since America has such a high percentage of food waste, do you think that we could solve 2 problems at once and use food waste as?
Yeah, that's one potential use for it because it's basically just like leftover biological material, and if we can find a way to process it efficiently, you can draw electricity from it or draw energy from it. And like actually one of the other common sources of biofuels is from the grease that they use in restaurants. You can convert that into biodiesel.
Yeah. Do you know, like, any of the apps mention that, or like have a,
About food waste,
yeah,
it's not in this app now. This focuses more on things that we can grow at a large scale, either as crops or that can be developed at a large scale in labs. And then the other thing that I wanted to talk about in addition to what biofuels are. So the primary reason for switching from gas, natural gas, petroleum, and fossil fuels to biofuels is for climate change. And I know some of the people in my lab debated last year, and climate change was an advantage on the plastics app. Could someone give me a quick summary of what climate change is? Mostly?
I mean, this may not be an explicit one, but basically an overview. So basically, our cars and other things emit gas that goes into our environment, and the way we live now is affecting the world we live in, I think. So if we change to other electric things, then that could stop climate change. In the word in climate change, it says the climate, the well-being of the earth, and then change, change.
Yeah.
So climate change is a thing that we really have to focus on, because if not, we literally will not be here. It's getting to a point now where if we don't take an act on it, then it's gonna get fast.
Yeah, that's a good start. No?
So basically, we all know that natural gases go to our ozone layer, but the gases we are creating, such as like plutonium, and like coal, those gases are also going to our ozone layers, creating, opening up like that atmospheric part and creating heat waves that are emitting heat.
I think you're a little off on the mechanism. It's not so much that things like carbon dioxide, methane go through the ozone layer. It's they stay in the atmosphere and they trap the heat of the earth against the earth, so that the earth, instead of cooling off the way it has for the last few hundred years, it continually gets hotter. And so that's what, Medina?
I believe climate change is a long-term period of alteration of temperatures and weather in different areas.
Yeah, that's also an explanation. And the key part to remember is it's largely driven by humans producing things like carbon dioxide, methane that are causing the climate change. And there are a lot of things that contribute to climate change. Like the biggest one we think of tends to be the production of electricity, which is from things like power plants, which we use coal and natural gas to create. It's why we're talking about shifting to renewable energy for our sources of electricity. In terms of biofuels, it's the gas that goes into vehicles, the gas that goes into our cars, trucks, and buses, that goes into ships, that goes into airplanes. I'll come back to you in 1 second. The carbon emissions are created both when we are when we're drilling for gas and oil, like if you ran the fracking app last year, you talked about how methane is released in that process, and also when we burn fossil fuels, that puts a lot of emissions into the air as well. So there are two parts when we use fossil fuels that contribute to climate change, and this is where biofuels come in, because the idea is that you don't get the same emissions when you're creating the biofuels to use, and they burn a lot cleaner, so the carbon emissions are much lower than they are with greenhouse gases. And when it comes to this year's topic, the US Department of Defense is the single largest consumer of fossil fuels in the world. And that's just the US. And if we work through NATO, we're looking at 31 other militaries that also consume a lot of fossil fuels. Most of them we don't have data for because they haven't collected it yet. But the US military does. So that's kind of the reason for addressing climate change in the military. And another thing to think about in terms of climate change is that the risks of what the results of climate change could look like are so catastrophic that I think a way to think about it is that every intervention that we can make, every step we can take to address climate change is probably worth taking. So like last year, we talked about fracking a lot on the water topic and talked about how banning fracking is an important way to combat climate change. This year, we're talking about biofuels and how getting off gasoline is another important way to combat climate change. No, you got a question? Okay. And then The other thing I want to talk about is this idea of working through NATO, which is a military and security organization, to address climate change, which seems like kind of an odd match. But the starting point, I would say, is that Jens Stoltenberg, who is the head of NATO, as Secretary General, used to work on climate issues at the UN before he joined NATO. And he's made it clear that he wants NATO to focus on climate change a lot more. And they've started doing a lot more work on climate. That's part of why they set up the research funds that I talked about earlier. And it's also part of why they've made it kind of one of NATO's core missions is to address climate change. And it's both because climate change creates more crises and more issues that NATO has to deal with. When you think about natural disasters, when you think about refugees, when you think about the kinds of tensions that can be created around the world because of climate change, that adds a lot more additional risk and stress to NATO. Rakeem?
Is there any like rule in NATO that obligates countries to fix climate change?
There aren't, not that I know of, but NATO as an organization gets to decide what its priorities are. And NATO as an organization has looked at the world and said, there are all these risks that we see emerging because of climate change, and we need to start thinking about how to address them now. And so NATO thinks that climate change is going to make the world riskier for NATO and its allies and the militaries. Climate change is also going to change the environment that armies operate in. Like they're worried, like NATO mostly prepares to operate in Europe, but they're looking at a period where Europe's going to get warmer, where it's going to be hotter, it's going to be a different environment. And also when NATO thinks about operating around the world, like it's operating in the Middle East, that's another spot that's going to get hotter and drier and kind of change the environment in which the militaries have to operate. And the last part is, like I said before, militaries contribute a lot to climate change, and NATO thinks that they can fix it. So that's like, so there's actually a lot of advocacy for NATO to get involved in climate change, which is one of the nice parts about this topic. And then I wanted to talk about a couple of, well, actually, let me pause there for a second. And I know I've just thrown a lot of information at you. Are there any questions or anything you want to ask me to clarify? Sir. Yeah, go ahead. No, you had your hand up earlier and I forgot about it.
Earlier you were talking about there's a lot of red tape that happens in a lot of biotechnology.
Mhm.
And we know a lot of countries, especially that are not on our side per se, don't have those, that red tape. And given how quickly we were able to develop something like the vaccine because of the removal of a lot of red tape, do you think it's something to look at to remove some of that red tape, or do you think it's
so? I mean, most of the red tape, when I think of it, when it comes to like biotech, is around food. It's around like food and medicine and like drug treatment, and that's mostly through the FDA. So like for the biofuels stuff, that's less of an issue because we're just creating fuels that are going to go into trucks and not things that are going to go into humans. I think one of the things that the response to COVID showed us is that we can move things like the vaccines and other treatments through the FDA a lot faster. Like the historic rate for approving a vaccine was something like 5 to 7 years. And we didn't have that much time, so they definitely rushed it. But the vaccines that we produced have been incredibly safe. They were based on, in most cases, something like 9 to 12 months of testing. So like, I think if there's one demonstration, if there's one thing we can learn about how we regulate biotech, it's that we probably overregulate. Like that's how I think about like the way that our bureaucracies responded to the vaccine. I think that answers most of your question. Okay. Right down here.
I noticed that it was when you say biotech, would biotech also include technology that could like enhance the body?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that is being worked on, sometimes specifically by militaries, because they do want to have soldiers who are stronger, faster, have more endurance, can deal with hot and cold temperatures better. So yeah, it sounds like science fiction, but it's things that are actually being worked on.
And then have any of these tests been successful?
I don't know the answer to that. Like I have read enough articles to know it's something that is being worked on by various governments, by various militaries, by some private companies. I'm not aware of the results of any of those studies yet. But yeah, it's out there. Like it's kind of the scary side of biotech is that it can be used to manipulate, kind of just how a human body functions for, in any number of different ways. Let's go to Rakib and then, or one student here and then to Gary. You did have your hand up, right? Okay.
I saw this thing on the internet that, like, scientists have found out a way to tell your muscles to stop growing or make them not stop growing.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they tested it on animals, and that what you mean by like forcing the human body to do things?
Yeah, like we know, like we're increasingly able to like change kind of the limits that the human body places on itself in terms of like how dense bones can be, the amount of muscle mass you can carry, how quickly your body recovers from like running or exercise. And so yeah, and it's a lot of it is figuring out how to turn on or off the switches that control like how a muscle grows.
So in terms of what the question was, what is the like big difference what is the difference between like cyborgs and people being like part?
I mean, it's the difference between
Cyborgs and people being
cyborgs?
Like, part
Mm-hmm.
like AI, I guess, and like medically and like scientifically enhancing soldiers. What is it?
So as much work as we've been doing on AI, I don't think we have anything yet that comes close to a cyborg. Like, so when I think of a cyborg, I think of it as essentially like a robot that has like a computer for a brain. Like, are we thinking about the same thing?
No, like humans who are like partially.
So like humans who have cyber.
So humans who have like artificial limbs and things like that.
Like humans who's like parts of their brains are like parts of their like how they function are.
Is like computer controlled.
So they're actually humans.
Yeah. So I know that there are a few companies that are working on developing like a direct brain interface where you can have a computer directly linked to your brain. Like Neuralink is an Elon Musk company that's trying to do that. I think we're still a long way away from that being like a functional thing or something that is available to the public. I suspect we'll probably get there, but I think we're still a long way away from that. I think some of the things we're seeing more so is like with prosthetic limbs for people who've like lost a limb, like it's been amputated or some other way damaged. We're getting a lot better at developing artificial limbs for them, which can still have kind of the appearance of a cyborg. But when I think of a cyborg, I think a lot more of what controls it. Like if it's a computer, if it's run by computer, run by brain, and we're still not there yet.
So my question is, so we all know how the military department of defense, they are basically the top emitters of petroleum and gas. And so how do you, so there's logisticians. Yeah, logisticians that are, because we want natural gases and biotechnology that can provide us gas, but the logisticians are preventing that. So do you think that if we eliminate, or I don't want to say eliminate, but remove those logisticians out of the way, that we were able to meet our goal for biotechnology?
So it's not so much that we need to remove the logisticians out of the way, it's that we need to change the NATO regulations. And so this is, has the lab that's in here, Dennis and Chris's lab, have you gone through the biofuels app?
Like the students have read it, and we talked a little bit about it.
Okay.
10,000 reviews.
Okay, so like it kind of does two things. It funds R&D into biofuels to develop advanced biofuels that we can use in the military. It also changes a NATO policy called the single fuel concept. And the single fuel concept, it was designed to make NATO militaries interoperable. And it basically means that NATO only uses two kinds of fuel, and they're both fossil fuels in all of their like airplanes and all of their like Jeeps and trucks and tanks. And there's some really good evidence in the app that says that the single fuel concept keeps NATO and NATO militaries from experimenting with new fuel sources, and that it also locks them into just these two fossil fuels. So the idea is that even if you were to develop biofuels, if you don't change the NATO policy, you can't use biofuels to you can't use biofuels as a substitute. And so the evidence talks about the logisticians who are afraid to make these changes unless the policy is explicitly changed. So it's more so like in the military, they follow a lot of orders. And if you change the order that says you can only use these fossil fuels to you can also use these biofuels, the logisticians will follow the new policy.
Okay, so it's basically the NATO making goals of basically.
Yeah. Yeah, and like in the plan, it's for the U.S. to work with NATO to change that policy so we can then use the biofuels that we create. Okay. And there's also, there are kind of two ways in which you can think about the impact that the act can have. One is that it's not just the U.S., it's 32 countries around North America and Europe who will be adopting biofuels into the military. There's also a long trend of successful military technologies being used outside of militaries, being used by the rest of the world. If you think about the three biggest examples are GPS, computer chips, and the internet, which were all largely funded, developed, and like built up over a period of years by the military that then became things that we now consider like integral to what we do. So I think there's good historical examples of the idea that if we develop biofuels for militaries to use, they will also get used in civilian cars and trucks. And it would be a big step towards helping us get away from using gas. I'm going to start on the right side and come around to this side.
So obviously we know that, well, from my understanding, that the military is kind of conservative in a sense. And so do you think that the military is cooperating with some of these changes on like the U.S. may want to like change some of their tanks to being like electric or something like that? Do you think they're like, working with them, or do you think they're opposed?
So there are a couple ways to think about it. One of them is that the goal with biofuels is that they work in the same vehicles that now run off gasoline or that run off diesel. And so part of the biotech research is to be able to develop these fuels that we can just use as a direct substitute. So it makes it really easy. And I think that means that there would be a greater incentive for cooperation. Part of it, especially when you talk about electrification, this is one of the negative arguments that's in the file. And right now, the U.S. Army is talking about trying to electrify a lot more of its vehicle fleet in the next 15 or 20 years. And part of it is because I think it gives a military edge. Part of it is because it helps them make progress against climate change. Like on electrification specifically, there are a couple of challenges. One is that when you have electric vehicles, electric tanks, things like that, you're more vulnerable to cyber threats, which in a military context is probably not great. You don't want to have your fleet of tanks that's sitting in Europe be vulnerable to Russian cyber attack. The other risk is that China controls a lot of the materials that go into electric vehicles. They control a lot of the like the key resources and rare earths. And it's not clear that you want to make the military dependent on a network of suppliers that includes has a big Chinese component. And so this is actually one of the files one of the arguments that's in the file. It's a question about whether the military should switch to biofuels or should be electrified. And I think it's winnable by either side. But I think if the military says we're going to use biofuels, I think the soldiers will happily pull up to a tanker full of biofuels and attach and like stick in the pump and go. I don't think they care that much about it being gas versus biofuels. And Rakeem, did you have your hand up?
Yeah. I remember thinking a negative argument. I don't remember which one exactly, but it said something about how he wasn't really going to do like NATO and the military developing the biofuels. I think you said something about NATO will pay other countries to do it. Is that true? Or do more like businesses just trying to make money?
Oh, so the way that NATO does most of its research is it doesn't do the research, it pays other people to do the research. Yeah. NATO controls the funds. So it would fund universities, it would fund private companies that have expertise in biofuels research or in the kind of science that are helpful for it. Those other groups would do the research, and then the results would come back to NATO. So that's a lot of how scientific research works. That's how it works in most of the US and most of Europe, where governments pay other people to do the research. And that's in like a lot of universities That's a lot of their budget, is that they win research contracts from the government to do for projects. Victoria?
What do you say what level of AI do you say that we are at right now, or where do you think our goal is?
I am by no means an expert in AI. I think our level currently, though, is very low compared to where it's going to be in 5 or 10 years. And as far as where it's going to go, I am equally very hopeful and kind of terrified by it, but I don't really know the answer. I know it's going to, in 5 or 10 years, it'll be very different. And then, did you have another question, Tino? You sure? Because you usually have a question. Medina, did you ever have that?
I have a question.
Okay.
About remember when you brought up CRISPR earlier?
Mm-hmm.
You said that it had the potential to expand in the future. If you had to expand like to be like a big biotechnology.
Yeah. Yeah, it can really change the way that we think about disease and medicine.
If you had to give an example of what you think it would be its most beneficial advancement in the future, what would it be?
Like I know that a lot of the genetic research into diseases focuses on things like cancer. I think there's probably going to be a line of research into things like Alzheimer's, where you have these diseases that are, we know in some ways genetically linked, and then also are they have either very high fatality rates, they kill a lot of people, or like with Alzheimer's, they are so devastating to families that finding a cure for it would be huge. But I think when we think about CRISPR, which is probably like the biggest impact in the near term over the next decade or so, would be finding cures to diseases that we don't know how to fix yet. And it's probably time for lunch. But any last round of questions, Noah?
Yeah, so my last question is, do you think that CRISPR would be helpful, I guess helpful when creating, like when you said earlier, somebody gets their arm amputated in a fatal accident, do you think CRISPR would be helpful to creating them a new arm that doesn't look robotic or prosthetic, but looks genetic?
So CRISPR is more about fixing issues at the gene level, like at the highly microscopic level. It's not really what we'd use to reconstruct an arm. Like we are getting into things like 3D biological printing, which is also a different kind of biotechnology. We're not there yet, but they're definitely getting to the point where they're now able to in some cases create like organs for transplants through 3D biological printing. And so like I think one of the goals is to be able to do that with limbs, but like I don't know what the current state of that technology is. But thank you. I hope this was in some way informative.
Thank you so much.